The Inferno Beneath Benxihu, A Tale of Survival and Tragedy. It was a bitterly cold morning on April 26, 1942, in the industrial heart of Liaoning Province, China. The sky was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind a thick veil of smog that clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. In the town of Benxi, nestled in the shadow of the mountains, life centered around the Benxihu Colliery, a sprawling coal mine that had been under Japanese control since the early days of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The mine was a bustling hub of activity, with thousands of workers, mostly Chinese laborers, many of them conscripted against their will, beginning their daily descent into the dark, yawning mouth of the earth. The miners worked in shifts, rotating every 12 hours to keep the mine running around the clock. They were a mix of men from various regions, some young and strong, others older and worn down by years of toil, all united by the grim reality of their existence. Among them was Li Wei, a 30-year-old miner who had been working at Benxihu for over 3 years. He was a man of few words, his once vibrant eyes now dulled by the relentless grind of life underground. Every day he kissed his wife and 2 small children goodbye before walking the familiar path to the mine, his footsteps heavy with the weight of resignation. Li Wei had seen many men come and go, some leaving the mine on stretchers, others never leaving at all. But he had learned to push these thoughts to the back of his mind. He had a family to provide for, and that was all that mattered. As the miners descended into the mine that fateful day, there was an uneasy stillness in the air. The tunnels, once filled with the steady rhythm of pickaxes striking coal, now seemed to hum with a barely contained energy. The mine's ventilation system, already insufficient for the sheer number of workers, was struggling to keep pace with the rising levels of methane gas, a dangerous, invisible killer that the miners had come to dread. The Japanese overseers, rigid and unsympathetic, were indifferent to the concerns of the miners. They were under orders to extract as much coal as possible to fuel the war effort, and nothing was to stand in the way of their quotas. Safety precautions were minimal, and any mention of the gas levels was met with a cold glare or a sharp rebuke. The miners had long ago learned that complaints were futile. They simply worked harder, hoping that luck would be on their side. In the depths of the mine, the atmosphere was stifling. The walls were damp with moisture, and the air was thick with the choking scent of coal dust. The miners worked in near-total darkness, their only light coming from the dim, flickering lamps they carried. The mine's tunnels stretched for miles, a labyrinth of narrow passageways that twisted and turned, each one more treacherous than the last. Li Wei was deep in concentration, his muscles straining as he swung his pickaxe in rhythmic strokes, chipping away at the coal seam in front of him. His fellow miners worked alongside him, their faces slick with sweat despite the cold air. The work was grueling, but they had grown accustomed to the routine. There was a strange comfort in the monotony, a sense of control in the midst of chaos. But that control was an illusion. At 3:10 p.m., the world as they knew it ended. The first sign was a sudden, sharp crack, like a thunderclap from within the earth itself. Li Wei barely had time to register the sound before the ground beneath his feet shook violently, knocking him to the ground. The air around him seemed to explode, a deafening roar filling his ears as a wall of fire and smoke tore through the tunnel, consuming everything in its path. The explosion was catastrophic. The methane gas that had been accumulating in the mine for days had finally found an ignition source, likely a spark from a tool or a malfunctioning piece of equipment. And the result was a blast that reverberated through the entire mine. The force of the explosion caused immediate collapses in several tunnels, trapping hundreds of miners beneath tons of rubble. Those who survived the initial blast were thrown into a living hell, as the coal dust suspended in the air ignited, creating a secondary explosion that sent a wave of searing heat and toxic fumes through the mine. Li Wei was stunned, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. The once familiar tunnel was now a scene of utter devastation. The walls, once solid and unyielding, had crumbled, and the air was thick with smoke so dense that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The heat was unbearable, the flames licking at the walls, turning the black coal into a blazing inferno. Desperate cries echoed through the tunnels as miners, disoriented and terrified, tried to find their way to safety. Some were too injured to move, lying amidst the rubble, their faces contorted in pain. Others stumbled through the darkness, their hands outstretched, searching for a way out. The explosion had knocked out what little lighting there was, plunging the mine into an even deeper darkness, broken only by the flickering flames that illuminated the twisted remains of the tunnel. Above ground, the first signs of trouble were felt as a tremor that rippled through the earth, followed by a low, ominous rumble. The Japanese overseers, stationed in the control room, exchanged uneasy glances but hesitated to act. The war had made them callous, their primary concern being the coal production targets that loomed over them like a specter. But when the realization dawned that an explosion had occurred, panic set in. The rescue operations were chaotic and poorly coordinated. The overseers, unfamiliar with the mine's intricate layout, were slow to organize a response. The few rescue teams that were sent down were ill-equipped to deal with the scale of the disaster. They were met with a scene of horror, collapsed tunnels, blazing fires, and the overwhelming stench of burning coal and flesh. In one of the intact tunnels, Li Wei, driven by sheer willpower, managed to pull himself to his feet. His body screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, knowing that he had to move or die. He stumbled forward, one hand against the wall for support, his mind racing. He had worked in these tunnels long enough to know them by feel, and he desperately tried to recall the safest route to the surface. As he moved through the tunnel, he encountered others, some who had survived the blast, others who had not. He saw the faces of men he had known for years, now lifeless, their bodies broken and charred. He tried to call out, but his voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The heat and smoke were making it harder to breathe, and every step felt like an eternity. At one point, Li Wei came across a collapsed section of the tunnel. The ceiling had caved in, blocking the way forward. He paused, his mind racing. The debris was too heavy to move, and he knew that time was running out. He could feel the heat intensifying, the flames creeping closer. In that moment, he made a decision. He would have to find another way out, even if it meant risking the unknown. Turning back, he retraced his steps, searching for an alternative route. His mind was clouded with fear and exhaustion, but he forced himself to focus. As he moved deeper into the mine, the air grew thinner, the smoke thicker. He knew he was running out of time, but he refused to give up. His thoughts drifted to his family, his wife, his children. He couldn't let them down. Meanwhile, above ground, the situation was deteriorating. As news of the explosion spread, the families of the miners began to gather at the entrance to the mine, their faces etched with worry. They had heard the rumors, the whispers of disaster, and they clung to the hope that their loved ones would emerge from the darkness. But as the hours passed and the scale of the disaster became clear, that hope began to fade. The mine's administrators, desperate to maintain order, tried to keep the families at bay, but their efforts were in vain. The crowd grew restless, their anxiety turning to anger. The reality of the situation was unbearable. The mine, a source of livelihood for so many, had become a death trap, and there was little anyone could do. Back in the mine, Li Wei's strength was fading. He had been wandering through the tunnels for what felt like hours, his every breath a struggle. The flames were everywhere now, a living, breathing monster that consumed everything in its path. He could feel the heat at his back, could hear the crackling of the fire as it devoured the coal around him. Just when he thought he could go no further, he saw a glimmer of light ahead. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was enough to rekindle his hope. Summoning the last of his strength, he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The light grew brighter, and with it the air became clearer. He was close, so close. Finally, he emerged into an open space, a large cavern where several tunnels converged. The flames were less intense here, and the air, while still thick with smoke, was breathable. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. He looked around, searching for a way out. In the distance, he could see a faint beam of daylight filtering through a crack in the rock. It was small, but it was a way out. He crawled toward it, every movement a monumental effort. As he reached the opening, he realized it was too narrow to crawl through. Despair washed over him, but he pushed it aside. There had to be another way. With trembling hands, he began to clear away the debris around the opening, pushing aside rocks and dirt, widening the crack inch by inch. His fingers were raw, his nails broken, but he didn't stop. Slowly, the crack grew wider, the beam of light stronger. He could hear voices now, faint but unmistakable. The rescue teams had finally arrived. With one last push, the opening was large enough to crawl through. Li Wei pulled himself through the narrow gap, the light growing brighter until, finally, he was outside. The cool air hit his face, and for a moment he simply lay there, staring up at the sky. He had made it. Against all odds, he had survived. But as he looked around, the reality of the situation set in. He was one of the few. The mine, once a place of work and routine, was now a smoldering ruin. The survivors were few and far between, their faces etched with the trauma of what they had endured. And for the families waiting above, the news was devastating. As the days passed, the full extent of the disaster became clear. Over 2,500 miners had perished in the Benxihu Colliery, making it the worst mining disaster in history. The mine, once a symbol of industry and progress, had become a tomb for those who had toiled within its depths. The aftermath of the disaster was marked by anger and grief. The Japanese authorities, under pressure from the growing unrest, were forced to acknowledge their role in the tragedy. But for the families of the miners, no amount of compensation or apology could bring back their loved ones. Li Wei, now a survivor of the inferno, returned home to his family, but the experience had changed him forever. The memory of that day, the faces of those who had not made it out, haunted him. He had survived, but at a great cost. And as he looked into the eyes of his children, he vowed that he would never forget the men who had given their lives in the depths of the earth. The Benxihu disaster remains a haunting reminder of the dangers faced by those who work beneath the ground, and the devastating consequences when safety and humanity are sacrificed in the pursuit of profit and power. It is a story of survival, of loss, and of the enduring spirit of those who, against all odds, fought to live.